The Smiling Human podcast is made possible by listeners like you. If you would like to experience more of these shows into the future, then please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Hello, and welcome to The Smiling Human, where collectively we evolve through inquiry. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Smiling Human podcast. My name is Oak, and I'm your host. Today, I'm speaking with Reko Vitae. Reko is a men's work coach, biodynamic breathwork facilitator, massage therapist, and has been running the Mythic Masculinity men's groups for the past 7 years alongside his brother. The two of them have been facilitating events, trainings, and all things personal transformation therein. He combines his knowledge of anatomy and somatic work with his passion for mythology and mysticism in order to awaken the soul's desire in men and to support in creating a more meaningful life for themselves and for the culture. Today, he and I explore the story of Iron John by Robert Bly and several of the meaningful events and symbols therein and how they pertain to the masculine journey as well as the current state of men's work. I hope you enjoy. Fantastic. Well, Reko, thank you so much for being a part of the Smiling Human podcast. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely. So the guests would have had a little bit of an introduction to you at the intro, but what I want them to know as well is that Reko participated and was an essential part of the No More Heroes Summit. He was present for both the opening and the closing circles. He hosted and participated in a trialogue discussion with his brother Manu, as well as hosted a signature talk on the king and spiritual castration. So for any of the listeners who are keen on today's topics or anything that I've just listed, you can listen to Reko's talks as well as all of the other men at the No More Heroes Summit at nomoreheroes.com/summit. So, Reko, I want to thank you again for having been such a major contribution to that summit, brother. Thank you.
Yes, my pleasure.
Yeah, and so today we are going to explore some interesting terrain, sort of tangentially related to the summit content, particularly looking at some of the core pillars within the Iron John story. And so for listeners who haven't heard the Iron John story, listen to it. It's available on audiobook on Spotify. You can pick it up at the library. It's definitely a core piece of reading. But why don't you lay out for us what you notice as the main pieces that are often focused on within the Iron John story in contemporary men's work, and then we can sort of flesh out from there.
Yeah, it's definitely I would say the foundational piece of literary work for men's work. Robert Bly wrote that in 1990, and he also is one of the founding fathers of the sort of mythopoetic men's movement that's now become so popular. So obviously, your audience is probably pretty familiar with some of that history, but the story itself has become like a foundational piece, a foundational story, but then also like the interpretation that he's brought forward has been like a really foundational part of men's work in general. You see that across various organizations, people pursuing their own groups with friends. It's kind of this almost like this Bible of men's work. And just to your question about like what pieces do I see being the most explored, the most emphasized, is in the first 4 chapters. We see that's where men's work has really served men, really been able to dig deep into those images. So I mean, the first one, that the very first image is like the digging the wild man out of the pond. There's so many retreats and workshops and stuff you can do that's focused on getting in touch with the wild man, pulling him out of the pond, pulling him out of that dead space within yourself, going deep into the woods, finding him, dragging him out, and bringing him into the light so we can look at him and see him again. And there's a lot of different ways that men can go about doing that, but I think that's where we have to start, right? If you're if you're living out of touch with any sort of wildness in your spirit, then that's where the journey begins. And the two other really emphasized images that I see after that is stealing the key from the mother and eating the ashes. So there's other images that pop up in the story between there, between pulling out the wild man and eating the ashes. But those three seem to be like the main things that get emphasized and focused on in men's work. And I think that there's a lot of great examples of like men's work really um, creating opportunities for men to reanimate those images in their own lives.
Exactly right. It's so interesting to recognize that just like the hero's journey as put forward by Joseph Campbell, even within this offering by Robert Bly, we see meaningful and almost segmented stages of this boy's trajectory into manhood. And the drawing forth of the wild man from the pond really is the first step. And I think that it's one of those ones where maybe when we're looking at stealing the key or eating the ashes or some of the other ones we'll look at, they don't necessarily come in sequence in our lives, although they come in sequence in the story. But none of the transformational potency of any of these other symbolic moments of Iron John have any vitality without connection to that wild man. And so what's lovely about this is it almost shows us that there's a layered depth available to us as men on this trajectory towards maturation. That there's something identifiable at every layer. Okay, I don't have connection to my wildness or my primality, my virility. Okay, we'll start there. Now that we've started there, what are the other pieces that we can start to unfold before we get more in alignment with what is essentially the gold of our spirit? And so from there, Reko, if you could give the listeners a little overview of the stealing the key and eating the ashes, what exactly are these two in the story and what do they signify?
Mm. Um, Big question. I'll really try to distill it here, but the stealing the key is, I see it as like an image of stealing your agency from the boyish tendency to regress into the mother. It's, in the story, the boy, in order to free the wild man from his cage, he has to go steal the key under his mother's pillow. And Michael Meade makes a great point about this. He says the pillow is where your mother keeps all her dreams for you as a boy. My son, the accountant, my son, the real estate agent, my son, the grade A student, that sort of thing. So the key to your agency rests underneath that pillow full of your mother's dreams for you. And also the key to the wild man's release. So that wildness in your spirit, that electricity, there's something deep and mysterious and wise that's available outside of that tendency or that inclination to regress into your mother's safety, your mother's desires, your mother's comfort.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, clarifying question. Now, this might be outing my own ignorance, and fair enough. This show is partly to alleviate my own ignorance through conversation with other wise folks. But it was my understanding that the boy in Iron John is a prince from another kingdom, and he's working in the kitchens of the kingdom, and that the key itself is under the queen's pillow. Is that correct?
So the boy originates in the kingdom where he is the prince to the king and the queen, and the wild man is brought into that kingdom. And it is then when he frees the wild man, they go into the forest together, and then from there he goes to a second kingdom. So in the original
Right.
kingdom, the queen and the king are actually his parents.
Right. Okay. So that's a doubly interesting layer here because I had my wires crossed, obviously. That it's not only the mother that he interacts with when it comes to the reclamation of his sovereignty, but also the divine feminine incarnate, this queen figure. And the queen mother, that's That's something to be reckoned with in some sense, because as you noted, and as is shown in the story of Iron John, in order to have access to the wild man who was caged by the king and queen, it should be noted that it was locked down, the prince has to transgress, quite literally break the rule or break the trust, break the bond by stealing. And it's not just stealing from the kitchen or, from the food stores, but it's stealing directly from what is, like you said, one of the most intimate places, not only where she communes with the king, but also right under her own pillow where she's having these dreams. And how I've landed on this interpretation is that there's the embodied dissolution of the son mother bond comes from the willful decision to move counter to what was almost a unified expression of being. Allow me to put that more simply. When we're growing up as boys, and this is true for girls as well, we are non separate from mother in a very non trivial sense. Our nervous systems are one. As babies, we cannot distinguish self from mom, it's one entity. And so we have that baked in. And there's this tendency and desire to go along with the desire and will of mother, because mothers are attuned to the vulnerability of children more than any other family member. So they have our safety in mind from an evolutionary point of view. So it is of great impetus for us to align with it. And yet, like you're noting, in order to actually access the gold, which is the wild man in some sense, but in the story, the prince kicks a golden ball into the wild man's cage. So there's this sort of double layering there. In order to get at something more than just boyhood, that actually has to be broken. And so hopefully that lends a clear picture for the listeners as to what stealing the key means, moving against this fundamental feminine relationship and setting out on our own. So I think that's good enough ground, at least for now, for a simplistic version. Let's shift to the symbol of eating the ashes.
Hmm. The ashes part is a really fascinating phenomenon that I see with regards to how um, it's such a tempting experience for men to get stuck there. And Robert Bly describes it as a descent. So we're starting kind of like in the woods with the wild man, and then we descend into the kitchen because the kitchen is described as below the palace. So you're kind of going into this like dungeon kind of space. It's dark, you don't see the light, it's hot, and your job is just to rake the ashes out of the kitchen's oven, right? Keep the oven clean so that it can keep cooking and keep burning. And your job is just to be in the hot, sweaty, sooty kitchen basement, shoveling all the ashes out. And Robert Bly has a really it's one of the most powerful chapters in the book by far. And he makes a number of points around that. So I'd encourage people just read it or listen to it to get the full description. But why I see it as so tempting to get stuck there is because there's activity in it, there's movement, and I think the spiritual journey is inherently one of purification. Purify the body, purify the mind, purify the soul. That's what leads us to greater insight. That leads us to greater alignment with natural law and with our environment and with our community. Um, it's also so eating the ashes is very much around purification. You're cleansing yourself of a lot of your past, your traumas, your wounds and addictions. But I see that it becomes itself an addiction, and ascending out of the ashes phase is something that there's a far more resistance to than going into it. One of the ways Robert Bly describes as going into the ashes is by um, a fall from social status. So you might lose your job, you might lose your house, your wife, all your possessions, your social circle, for a variety of reasons, right? You might have been a gambler, you might have been a drinker, you might have also just, got fired from your job. Life happens, fate happens, and with that, the fall occurs and puts us in that position to do that purification work. Typically, it occurs when we've become very stagnant. So life can push us down into it, or we can descend consciously. But either way, coming back up is something that I see that men really resist. And sitting in a men's circle, I ran one for 5 years, but I've been sitting in men's circles for closer to 10. And in that time, what I see is like the most excitement men get is when they're in the ashes. Um, so it's just an interesting phenomenon. I'm not saying that that's a problem. I'm not saying that's the way it should be either. I think that it's one of the things to be aware of if you are finding yourself in that position. That hey, you're not, your fate isn't to be here. This is a stage in the story.
Mm-hmm. And what a beautiful way to say it, too, that there's a beginning and an end to each of these phases of maturation. And in listening to you, Reko, about the difficulty that you've witnessed men experiencing in terms of coming out of the ashes, it occurs to me that the difficulty men might be experiencing leaving these purification processes comes from the fulfillment that men get at completing something. And when we're talking about purification, when we're talking about getting down and raking the ashes, finding all of those little embers of resentment, anger, guilt, victimhood, attachment, whatever it is, that could be an endless process until the very day we die. And so there's almost a sense of, well, is it done yet? Am I clear enough? Am I strong enough? Have I done enough? Have I achieved fully enough to be able to judge that, yes, now is the time to leave? And I can see that, not just in men's work, but in spiritual work in general. People get really hung up on healing, right? Oh, I need to heal. I need to heal. I need to heal. Maybe, probably. Like we all
One
have
more
been,
ayahuasca journey.
right? One more ayahuasca journey, one more psilocybin trip, whatever it is. But in actuality, some of that is effective and necessary, absolutely. Having sat with both of those on multiple occasions, I get it. And yet, the hang up is there's going to be a point where you've been burnt enough that if you keep burning, then you can't build anything new. Eventually, we're going to burn down to something core, and it's that core that you then take up and out. And I think that that's a really important thing. We're not going down to zero, we're going down to essentials. So I think that that's a potent piece to look at. How does that land?
Yeah, no, I think you're right on with that. It's um, and like I said before, not to make any of it wrong either. It becomes a place of safety. It becomes a place of familiarity that like where I see the healing journey going, like for myself, for a lot of people that I've worked with in, been working in the healing arts for almost a decade now. So what I consistently see is like the step into healing comes out of necessity, almost always. There's a necessity for it. And then it becomes familiar. And then what's after that? Right? Like how do I then take this gold that I've gotten from the healing journey, integrate it into something where I'm more generative and more creative and able to apply myself in the world rather than seeing myself as broken and needing to fix myself, work on myself constantly. Um, in particular, the idea that I'm not ready is a big one, because as soon as you step out of that healing process, you have to take on some place in the world. And that's a big step. It's a scary step. It's also one that requires looking at how we've been identifying and choosing for ourselves what it is we want to be in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I see this with a lot of things too that become kind of the regulating position or the regulating pillar in our lives, like working out. You start working out because you want to get healthy, and then you get body dysmorphia and you can't stop, and you're never good enough. And you just find out that there's more to heal, there's more to work out, there's more to train, there's more to fix, and that itself becomes the fixation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's the externalization of value and competency. I will be good enough when X circumstance occurs outside. When in some sense, there's no external circumstance that in and of itself grants you that completeness. Only we project onto or accept an external circumstance as the stimulus for that sense of good enoughness. And it's really interesting that you talk about this. You didn't use the word necessarily, but the victimhood, this sort of brokenness. And sometimes the brokenness is deeply shame based, and people are like, oh, it's just who I am. And other times it's deeply, deeply rooted in resentment. So it's like, oh, they did that to me. But either way, it bars us from our inherent generativity. If we have this inherent sense of brokenness, if we are consistently reinforcing a vision of self and man as broken or incomplete, then the generativity that is at the heart of kingship is completely inaccessible. And there's some interesting pieces in Iron John that have to do with the king and the relationship to the king. And so maybe we can look at some of those and extrapolate how our own relationship to king energy can determine whether or not we take the throne or we end up, muddy, drunk, and desperate.
Or maybe both.
Or maybe both. Who knows?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the king, the image of the king shows up in like you said, in many different ways in Iron John. I think part of the reason why people resist coming out of the ashes is because the very next image that arises is to come face to face with the king, and to come face to face with the king in that very ashy, sooty state. The boy is summoned from the kitchen to serve food to the king. He's covered in ash. He's got his hair covered, and he's face to face with the king. And in that interaction, the king confronts him about wearing a hat, about having his hair covered. And the boy, I mean, the initiation here is that the boy has to refuse the order to take it off. Now I see that image as like very symbolic of that's like the confrontation with the father, and not necessarily our father, but the image, the projected image that we're still carrying of our fathers out into the world once we leave his domain. So for example, I saw a number of times leading a men's group is that guys will still have stuff around their father that shows up interacting with other men, even men that they trust, especially men that they trust actually, but bosses, um, friends, roommates, government, politicians, celebrities. It's whoever fits the bill, they get projected that image of the father. They carry that projection, and it's really hard to move the world with any agency or any sovereignty when there's my father over there, there's my father over there, there's my father over there, and it's all just influencing how I engage and how I bring my own, as you say, generativity. I can't create in the world with any sense of sovereignty if I'm rejecting men because I'm projecting my father onto them.
Mm-hmm.
Or not, maybe not rejecting. It could be the opposite. It could be looking for something from them, right? This is something I brought up in the summit, was like we spend time around gurus looking for fathers. We spend time around mentors looking for fathers, trying to get that essence we didn't get from our actual father, from some other man, and that keeps men away too.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That keeps men at an arm's distance. We can't really be close to somebody if we're trying to get some fathering from them.
Mm-hmm. There's three core words that come to my mind, having opened this gateway into the different symbols of the king in Iron John. And these three words are identity, domain, and agency. And you introduced agency a couple times here. And I think that that's actually the shared connection point between identity and domain. And allow me to rope some of these other pieces in here. So when we're talking about stealing the key, one of the core pieces from a psychoanalytical point of view that's necessary for the maturation of the boy psyche into manhood is the separation from the mother, but also the confirmation and validation from the feminine that he is male. And this is an identity piece, right? Not only do I have to be seen as distinct, but distinct and different. And that's a really important piece to remember, that when we steal the key, we introduce the opportunity into our lives to interact with the feminine in a way that she might actually validate. We differentiate through our actions, and that elicits from a healthy, divine, mothering feminine spirit that validation of maleness. So that's the one hand for identity. The other side is this refusal of the king. No, I will not take my hat off. This is the domain. So although he is the prince, he lives in the kingdom, and the king is the head of the kingdom, authoritarily speaking. What he's doing in this initiation by disobeying or making a choice against the king is he is declaring the boundaries of his own domain, which is an act that we don't actually have defined explicitly in our current culture. It's not clear what a domain is or where the boundaries are for men. And for those listening, a domain, as I use it, is everything we have a right to or a responsibility for. And so the prince has a responsibility to listen to the king, but he also has a right to his own privacy, to keep his hair covered and not be seen as he is. And so there's a conflict between these two, and the initiation is choosing what is a rightful domain at that point in his trajectory. So the identity is in the relationship to the queen. The definition and expansion of domain comes from the refusal of the king. And the intersection of those two is the birth of agency. Who am I and what can I do? I think that that's an interesting way to conceptualize it, but I'll pass it back to you from here.
I don't know how to follow that. That was amazing. I love that. That's an entirely new way of thinking about agency for me, and the cross section of like mother and father, or feminine and masculine orientation towards our own identity as a man. So I really love that. And what occurred to me as you said that too was so throughout Iron John there's several interactions which so I mentioned his hair is covered, right? So I'm gonna kind of assume anyone listening to this has read the story, otherwise I have to read it all out for you. So I mean the story itself as at the bare minimum, I hope, but like reading Iron John is also a really worthwhile thing to do to get more out of what we're talking about here. But there's several points in the story where the boy is required or requested that his hair be shown and his cap be removed. The reason he has it on is one where there's a few ways to interpret it, but essentially his hair is gold, and that gold is what he's hiding. He's protecting that gold, and we don't necessarily know why. There's no particular reason that is stated, but my interpretation is that the reason changes as the requests for his hair to be revealed change. His maturation changes the reason he keeps it covered. So initially, he's very embarrassed. His hair turns gold by accident. He made a mistake and it turns his hair gold. So he's embarrassed. And he hides it from the wild man. And the wild man says, "Take your hat off. I know that your hair is gold." Next, he goes to the palace. He goes and works in the kitchen. His hair is covered so it doesn't get covered in soot and ash. He protects it from getting all, losing that gold sheen and shimmer. He protects it. Next, he faces the king and he keeps it covered. And this one I think is fascinating because there's a clear demand to remove his hat, but showing the king at this stage when he has nothing to his name. It says in the story too, he's got no skills. The only reason he worked in the kitchen is because he had no skills. He had no knowledge. He was as good as his body could labor. That was it. But he So if he goes to the king and reveals his golden hair at that point, he might be acknowledged for it. He might be rewarded for it. But for what? He's achieved nothing. He's got no renown. He's got nothing to his name, no achievements. So it's premature. And this is what I call a lesser reward. So he would be accepting a lesser reward than what he ultimately is, his destiny or his fate is for him. So that's the first request since the wild man to remove it. The next one, so he goes to the garden after the kitchen, and he's working in the garden, and he takes his hat off one day because it's hot, and the princess sees his golden hair. She's infatuated with it and summons him to his chamber. So he covers it again really quick and brings her some flowers, and she tries to pull it off. And 3 days in a row, she invites him to her room to bring flowers. 3 times she tries to pull it off. All 3 times he stops her. And this one I find is a fascinating. It's very different from the other 2, right? The first one is shame. The next one is refusing the lesser reward. This one I see as he's in the garden cultivating. He's creating. The inner. Robert Bly describes it as the inner garden. So it's where you cultivate intentionally. It's where you plant that which you would later sow. But he's not so. That's that which you would later reap. So he's planting now, but he's not harvesting, and it would be again premature, but also he at best could create a fleeting and sensual or like passing relationship with this princess, right? For now, he's a gardener's boy. That's it. That's all he's got to his name. So she might love him for the summer, right? She might have a quick romance or a fling with him. But that's, again, a lesser reward from what he's ultimately pursuing as his fate.
Mm-hmm.
And so the covering is to protect one from lesser rewards. It would be the same as, somebody having an insight and saying, now I have to write a whole book around this one insight. And, you and I were talking the other day about the difference between thought and thinking. I had a thought, so I need to write a book about it. And then writing a book actually requires a lot of thinking, and I'm not ready for that. So I'm going to create something that's either I have to then put a lot of time and effort into creating something and working for it, thinking about it over a long period of time and refining it for a greater result, or I can try to gather as much recognition for this one thought now as possible and accept the lesser reward for it.
Mm-hmm. In some sense, and this didn't occur to me until just now listening to you, we might interpret the hair as his vital essence, his spirit, or phallos, we might say, and that in each of these instances, it's being requested to be dedicated, like you're saying, to a lesser reward, or he skirts missing the target by refusing lesser rewards. And in our initial conversation, we spoke about the interplay between lesser rewards and lesser thrones. And if we're looking at his hair as the essence of his vitality, his spiritual life force as a man, his phallos, then in interacting with the king says, dedicate your phallos to my domain. He says, no. And the princess says, dedicate your phallos to my fascination, to my pleasure. And he says, no, because these are not the highest possible point or aim that he could be dedicating his energy to, which is his own throne. And the reason that that's such a key piece, and you've articulated all the other pieces for me to be able to put this together, so thank you, is that he has not yet fleshed out the fullness of his domain such that his gold is recognized for what it is. When he's a gardener's boy, whatever, you're a gardener's boy. He's not the king yet, right? Oh, you're a kitchen boy, whatever, you're a kitchen boy. Or later on, in another instance where his hair is revealed is after he goes through the warrior's initiation and his helmet gets pulled off and it's revealed to everybody. Well, what's fascinating about this is this actually lines up with this idea of lesser thrones, because it's only after the warrior's initiation has he left boyhood behind. He's not all the way to kingship, but now he has actually begun to awaken and align that potency with a higher purpose that only came through several different types of trial. So that's particularly interesting to me and hopefully interesting to the listeners. But we'll take a short break here and we'll come back with the second half of the show and likely explore these topics in greater depth. I hope you're enjoying the show so far. I wanted to take a brief moment to talk about just how you can help this show grow into the future. Did you know that we have an Instagram, a YouTube, and a Patreon? Probably. But if you're listening on YouTube, like many of you are, I would invite you to subscribe, to like this video if you've enjoyed it, and to leave a comment. Let me know what you thought. Let me know if you have any questions or maybe guests that you want me to interview. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Music or any other podcast platform, then please take this moment to rate the show. All of these actions go a long way to helping the Smiling Human podcast reach more people and grow into the future. Thank you so much. Fantastic. Well, we are now back with the second half of the show, which starts with a section called The Question of the Week. This is where I invite our guests to bring forward an inquiry, something maybe they want to ask me or they think the audience would benefit us speaking about. So, Reko, what have you got for us this week?
So we've been talking about the lesser rewards. And I think it might be easier to identify what the lesser rewards are. Being like, oh, it's, lust and fleeting desires, distractions, all that. Serving someone else, working for somebody else. But my question is, what is the greater reward? What is that ultimate reward that at the end of the story, when the boy reveals who he is and is given princess's hand in marriage and becomes heir to the next kingdom, what is that? And I'll add one layer to it too, because it seems like this is a question underlying men's work, whether people are consciously asking it or not. But what is it that men are ultimately on this journey towards that isn't just Ash's work, that isn't just digging the wild man out? Like, all of this is an arc, all of this is a journey, but what is that final point?
You get me back for the big question earlier, hey? Wow. Oh, the first things that come to mind when looking at the highest reward, which is the throne itself. Essentially, you're asking me, what is the nature of the throne? What is the nature of kingship, right? This is telos. Contentment, genuine merit, and legacy. These are the three things that came to mind. So contentment is to say that, well, let's look at the example. If he got with the princess before he was given her hand, he might have had pleasure, but he would have lost that and not had the contentment that comes along with being for real chosen by a woman. That's a huge piece. And being chosen not based off of fascination or obsession, as was the case in the first instance, but of authentic recognition of the quality of his character. And this is where it brings us into the idea of genuine merit, right? There's nothing more gut tightening when we're watching a movie or reading a book than reading a character who is given something that they absolutely don't deserve. And we know that for ourselves. And you might say, oh, well, maybe I'm just playing small, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes. But we have a pretty good sense of knowing when we are being bestowed something that is far beyond what we are rightfully due. And no man could live under that weight for very long, not without cracking. And so this sense of this is rightfully mine because of the quality of my character, because of the completeness with which I have committed myself to what I understand to be the highest order values, be that truth, justice, honesty, authenticity, protection of the innocent, what have you. There's many we could look at. There's a congruency, an internal congruency that forms the foundation of capable leadership. Like, we could not hope to lead if we had deep cracks in the foundation of self-trust. If we did not know that we could fall back on our own merits, our own capacity to decide and discern. And so this genuine merit is a big piece of it. And the contentment is a piece of it that is sort of a symptom of it. When we know we are capable, we're more at ease. No trouble necessarily rocks the boat too much. And this leads me to the last of the three, which is legacy. And this is something that transcends the personal life. And I think this is where we start to see the connection between divinity, sovereignty, kingship, and this sort of the highest possible principle. What I mean by this is that when we as humans aim at a social target that transcends our own life, we are declaring that there is something more worthy than our own wants to be served. This recognition is selfless, it is generative, and it is deeply rooted in power. And what I get from this is that in order to have the wisdom needed to identify what goal, what kind of legacy, what quality of kingdom we most ought to bring forward, we have to be in touch with a wisdom that also transcends our individual person. So to serve the transpersonal domain, we need to be in contact with the transpersonal wisdom. And in order to be in contact with the transpersonal wisdom, we have to not be hung up or obsessed with our own sense of self. There's a subjugation, right? Although the king is subject to none but God, something like this. So there's a big picture for you, Reko, for a very big question. I'll hand it off to you.
Right. Oh man, several things you said, I'm like, yes, exactly. The being bestowed something that is not that you have no right to is it's not a blessing at all. That's a curse. And what occurred to me there is being bestowed something isn't always the actual result, but the desire. And the word desire, actually the Latin root for it means to come down from the heavens or to come down from the stars. So it descends. There's a quality of descent to desire, which it comes down into us. And then it's our actions that reach up towards it. So there's this grandness to desire that like it's way beyond us. It's heavenly in its origin and bestowed upon us from the stars, which historically have been associated with fate and the gods and the divine. So it's this divine gift that descends upon us, and it's bestowed upon us. And to be given a great desire doesn't mean to take on great actions. In fact, it often means we have to take on very humble actions. And there's one thing to have desire for great things. There's another to have a great desire. And something that I support men with getting clear on is like, whether coaching or men's work is, what is it you desire? What is your great desire? Not the great things that you desire to have or to achieve, but what is this arc that what is that great gift or that ultimate reward that you're aiming for? That's the great desire. And it's going to take humble actions. It's going to take the kitchen. It's going to take the garden. It's going to take saying no to a lot of things along the way. The way that we lose that great desire is accepting the lesser rewards. And yeah, there's, I think, so many people get lost in this pursuit of the great of the ultimate reward, the ultimate fate, when they get disenchanted by the whole process because the actions are humble. It's like, I want to do great things, I want to achieve great things, so I have to take great big actions. And then they go to take action and they get stuck. They can't move because, as you said, they're not really worthy of it yet. They haven't got that, as you said, like the contentment in knowing that you are worthy of it. And so, like, I've got a dozen projects, a dozen goals that I'm working on right now where I'm like, man, I could theoretically have that achieved in a month, but the actions to get there are actually like really preparing me to take on and own that like when I achieve that thing, I will actually be ready for it. And until
Mhm.
then, life is going to let me know if I'm not.
And invite you into the experiences that might prepare you to receive such an experience,
Mm,
such a
yes.
reward. One of
Yeah.
the pieces that I want to extrapolate on that you named here is that, for those who desire to do great things and attempt to achieve them by taking great action, I think that they're actually more interested in being the one who did the great thing, and that actually constitutes an inflation of ego. That's an incomplete and unintegrated drive. That's still very heroic. That's seeking this kind of validation externally through social gratification or social validation in that kind of sense. And that's a really important thing to remember, that the kingliest of men who have ever walked this earth were humble. They were willing to bend their knee, and only in the circumstances where the outcome of taking that humble stance, embodying that humility, had great benefit for other people, more benefit for others than for themselves. And I think that we are uncovering here that underneath these great archetypal and mythopoetic stories are what could be called the currents of divine truth. And this is quite a sparky idea in my system, because what it means then is that this mythopoetic journey towards kingship, towards the reclamation of our own power through it, denying the king or distancing from the mother or raking the ashes or tending to the garden, they're actually supported by something that is transpersonal. It goes beyond the Reko and the oak and whoever you are, listener, that your own embodiment, be it as a woman or as a man, to its fullest requires relationship with something that transcends it. It's almost paradoxical, but it's also deeply liberating, because now we're no longer required to be the only source of power, insight, and action. In fact, there is a current much stronger and wiser than our own mind and will to which we can align. And that alignment is no different than the humble supplication of the king to the highest principle. That's in essence what it is. When we say, yes, I give over my will to something wiser, more intelligent, more compassionate, and better for the whole, I mean, that's the essence of sovereignty, at least
Mm.
in one estimation.
Yeah. Once again, wow. Um, the uh, the value of the let me restart there. The great thing about having a desire is that it is at least a target. And um, there's a lot of people out there that just don't know what they want. And that's a dangerous thing, because now the desire is for a desire. And so I'll just desperately pick something. And typically that leads to picking something which gets me recognition, which
Mm.
gets me value, which gets me um, sense of meaning. But ultimately, it's, I don't particularly want anything in life. I don't feel drawn to a cause or a purpose or a, a craft is really the thing I associate with a meaningful life. Like, what's your craft? What are you creating? And so, the place a lot of guys start is they'll pick something and then stick to it because it's something, not because it's the not because it's the desire that they are unfolding into, but because it's something to latch onto.
Mhm.
And it doesn't lead to humble actions, it leads to inaction,
Mm.
complete inaction. Like, so for example, let's say right now I'm working a job that's boring and unfulfilling, and I don't have any hobbies or particular skills that I'm developing and honing. And I'm not in the practice of reading and learning new subjects that inspire me. How can I decide what I want in life? Because there's nothing really guiding me. There's no inquiry into a deeper experience of what I'm already doing or what I'm already learning. And
Mhm.
I think men's work in particular drew so many people in initially with like the Minnesota Men's Conference because it spoke to those men and it gave them a variety or a whole palette of things to dive into: poetry, philosophy, craftsmanship, desire. It started to spark that spirit and dig out that wild man. But there's the arc to the story is one that actually there's a whole bunch of work that has to come before you get a sense of what you're actually working towards. It's a whole lot of confusion, and then the desire hits. And then when that desire hits, you're in the garden and you're planting seeds and you're growing things. But like, all this work comes before there's any sense of what it's all for.
Mhm.
And um, usually the process you take to get from digging out the wild man to the garden starts to prepare you to have a desire that leads to some reward,
Mhm.
leads to the throne. So, for example, for me, I spent, you know, like 6 years pursuing the healing arts, learning, training, not necessarily being like a master and facilitator in them, but practicing and receiving a lot, going through my own process, going through my own journey, doing the same thing right now with coaching, working with doing training programs. Like, I've been training in that for 2 years, and it's all focused on me going through my own process. And the reason for that is, like, you know, it's not a technique. You don't start from nothing, master the technique, and then just start being of service to other people. It's it's the actual process of digging out the wild man, stealing the key, eating the ashes, then getting into the garden and having something that's been cultivated over time.
Mhm.
So, like, for me, it's been like working with people, healing arts, coaching, men's work. But, guys, I've worked with farmers, I've worked with builders, I've worked with designers, I've worked with other healers, massage therapists. I've worked with a variety of people in the men's work realm where the process is still the same. And they find their art, they find their craft, they find their angle into life. It's like that's your foothold into the door of life. That's what gets you into the garden. And then once you're there, then you have access to that wide open space that you can lay out under the stars, and desire actually descends into you.
Mhm. And upon its descent, our capacity to recognize it as such and as worthy is there and ready. There's a sense that the whole core of what you're putting forward is that in order to dedicate the potency of our masculine spirit to something meaningful, we need to have at least some idea of what we are. And I like to use the analogy of resolution, that when we're deeply wrapped and immersed in stories, false stories about who we are or who we ought to be, we're in a very low resolution environment of who and what we really are. And that when we start to ask these questions and do the work, dive in, introspect, meet with other men, have conversations, meet challenge, what we're doing is we're slowly and slowly increasing the resolution of our inner awareness. It's not that
Mm.
we're increasing the detail of our egoic construct, not quite, but we are becoming more conscious in the present of what it means to be human. And in so doing, the differentiation between my desire and a great desire actually increases, because it's only through presence that familiarity is cultivated. And that's an important thing to remember. And so with this, I want to add another piece in response to what you have spoken to, Reko, which is even when men pick subordinate or low targets, low hanging fruit for their lives, and they grab onto it like a buoy in a storm, what that really highlights is the absolute necessity of an aim. We need something to orient towards. And I think this is true for all humans, and maybe it's just a bit more pronounced and exaggerated within the masculine temperament. But without an aim, we don't have a singular point around which all other actions, ideas, and endeavors orient themselves in some kind of order. It literally brings order to chaos. It's the essence of logos, right? And this then, I would say, illuminates the necessity of quality, right? What is the quality of the desire? And the higher the quality, the greater the order, but also the greater the actions that inhabit that order will become. This is where the challenge comes in, right? We can only hope to rise towards a goal as much as we are willing to do the inverse in terms of like pleasurable action. It's like if it's a really great goal, we have to do some really unpleasant stuff to get there. And the higher the goal, the more work it's going to take in that kind of area. And by being willing and supplicant, like this divine sovereign principle, to die, and this is an interesting piece that maybe would take us another episode to explore, but this willingness to sacrifice these lower desires, sacrifice these lower thrones, is the core action required on the path to kingship. Not this, not this, not this, not this. And it's in contrast to all of these other lesser thrones that it's almost like a blooming. It's like, okay, if it wasn't any of those, what is it? Well, you'll know, because your soul will sing in resonance when it reveals itself to you. And that's kind of like when the student is ready, the master will appear. Right? When the king is ready, so too will his throne appear. So,
Mm. Mm. I like that. The and the in order to say yes to that throne, as you said, you have to say no to so many lesser thrones. Yeah. And I think
100%.
human culture has known that for a long time. And perhaps in recent generations, the more consumerist, hedonistic culture has surpassed that ancient wisdom. But like you see that with the practice of chastity, saying no to lesser lust for the higher love, and you see that in the Renaissance with the masters like Da Vinci and Michelangelo, who I was just reading about Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel, and he resented doing it. He was convinced by the Pope to paint the Sistine Chapel, a massive project. Took him 4 years. It's 1,200 or 12,000 square feet. He's like 70 feet up in the air, looking straight up, craning his neck, painting the ceiling, and And he resented doing it because he's a sculptor. He never considered himself a painter. And yet it's easily the most amazing work of art in Western culture. It's profound. People travel from all over the world to see it. It's a truly remarkable story to know that, somebody who didn't want to do that was able to produce something so masterful that hardly anybody today or since could even come close to something that incredible. And so that's what I see in that story is the throne is mastery, right? He didn't I this is my interpretation, but I don't think he did amazing work purely out of an ego reputation drive. He wasn't doing it because he's so egotistical he couldn't be lazy about it. But the commitment to mastery, that anything that I produce is going to be the best thing I could possibly produce. That's a commitment. That's a yes to a great pursuit, a great desire. Whereas to collapse into that resentment and produce something of a lower quality would be an insult to that desire and would be saying yes to something lesser.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It'd be saying yes to a lesser vision of self.
Yeah.
And a lesser vision of self keeps the gold from the world. And I want to just make a quick point to the chastity note that you mentioned. It's quite synchronous because I was reading yesterday in a book called Cosmos and Psyche, and in the introduction, in the foreword rather, it talks about chastity in brief, in passing, and it also talks about Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci and Galileo. So you mentioned both of those in the same breath, and I was like, I read that on a page yesterday. And the essence that I wanted to respond to is that chastity is not just about the denial of temptation, but it's the denial of temptation and these lesser rewards towards and for the point of a higher one. We don't just not engage in frivolous and casual sexual activity for the point of not doing it. We do it in order to be prepared to receive the divine partnership that we seek. And that's really the point that needs to be made. It's that it's not just denial for denial's sake, austerity for austerity's sake. It's a practice that is the embodied recognition that some things are more worthy than others. And I'll close with this. You mentioned that current culture is consumed by this hedonistic and short-sighted mentality. And I think it's because we are not gathering with those who remember the consequences of choosing lesser thrones, right? Like when we are gathering around in the stories that were once the anchors of our culture, the anchors of our psyche, the communal wellspring that oriented us through time, past, present, and future, those were shared around fires and around tables as we were meeting and joining daily, weekly, monthly. And that kept it fresh in our minds that, hey, you might be tempted to do something really stupid. Let me tell you about a guy who did that and how it went. You go, oh, wow, okay, we probably don't want to do that. I don't want to be like that guy. And it's this revivification through the reiteration of history and myth that keeps the relevance and necessity of these kinds of higher order wisdoms at the forefront of the cultural mind. And because we have dispersed, we have this disappointing diaspora into individualism and screens and prolific selves and social media, the essence of what we are has, as a consequence, either from deliberate choice or otherwise, succumb to temptation. Essentially, to use not to end on such a dramatic note, but we have really started to sin in the term of hamartia. We're missing the target as the main way of living. It's not just that we have a little deviation. We're just like, yeah, let's just shoot it anywhere all the time. No target. Make your own target. Postmodernism was right. There really is no intrinsic thing to aim at. Anything will do. We're seeing now that that's not the case. So forgive me for my little soapbox here. I want to pass it back to you, Reko, for the brothers and sisters that are listening, that are interested in the work that you do, that want to hear more from you and connect. Where can they find you?
Amazing soapbox. I'll sit and listen to it anytime. So my men's work brand is called Mythic Masculinity. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook right now. We'll have a podcast coming out soon called Becoming Brothers, which we'll be posting there. My personal Instagram is Reko Vitae, and that's where I do most of my posting. I'm located in Victoria, BC, and I work with people one-on-one. We do men's group events, we do breath work, we do poetry nights. We're not doing men's groups anymore, but if you want any consulting on how to start your own, I'm more than happy to jump on a call and support anyone who's eager to start something in their community. And aside from that, always posting things, my writing, working on a book, and I'm always posting ideas like that. So if anything I said resonated, just follow, and yeah, like I said, feel free to reach out, ask questions.
Mm-hmm. And as always, all of those links will be in the video description and the show notes for this episode. And as well, if you want to listen to us speak more in depth on these topics, there are 4 different talks at the No More Heroes Summit that feature this brilliant brother here. So check it out at nomoreheroes.ca/summit. Reko, thank you, brother.
Thank you, Oak.
And that concludes this episode of the Smiling Human podcast. Thank you so much for listening. But before you go, I have 2 invitations for you. The first invitation is to receive a free gift. I've created a free insight journal. This is a 30-day self-reflection and introspection journal that you can download at no cost in the description below. Go have a look and join the journey. The second invitation I have for you is, if it feels within your means and possible for you, then please head over to patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Becoming a patron will give you access to perks like behind-the-scenes footage and access to live Q&As with me monthly. You also get voting privileges to help pick new guests or to help guide other episode content. Truly, the support of listeners like you, paid or unpaid, goes a long way. So if you could like, share, subscribe, and give a rating on the podcast app, all of that goes a long way. Thank you to each and every one of you who's been on this journey with me. See you again soon.